Greetings, I am Deft Funk, and I will be reading What If by Lynked. The sky was alight with an orange glow that can only be produced by a dying flame. Streaks of gold, red, and a dash of purple spanned the emptiness as the light died away, a darkness rising in its place. The air was chilled and only growing colder as a brisk breeze washed across the desolate, flat cloudscape that sat gray in the sky. It blocked the beautiful array from gracing the ground like a shield to a flower. It was a shame, too. Sunsets were a gorgeous display, soothing and serene as the twilight hours flickered briefly. Across the expansive gray blockage, atop the lumps and hills of rumbling clouds, sat an outstretched lump of vivid cyan. A multi-hued spectrum of rainbow-streaked strands pulled from beneath her, creeping over small mounds of bland fluff. Her eyes were blind to the world, open only to the mesh of warm and cold above her. The yin-yang of the twilight hour always seemed to worm its way into her core and burrow in for a while, before fleeting quicker than it had came. Her chest expanded as she drew a deep, long breath. It released as a low sigh, her chest deflating once more. Head propped up on her forearms, she lay in silence, doing no more than staring up at that thick canvas called the sky. She seemed grim. Even her eyes, trained though they were, drooped in a forlorn gaze. Upon her mouth was the tiniest hint of a frown. Nothing more serious. Not a scowl, a grimace, or a sneer. Simply a frown. Though the somber serenity that wafted through the cool breeze was bittersweet, the taste on the back of this mare's tongue was sour and pungent. The weight of her eyes was unbearable. The dark, heavy bags beneath them sagged as though they were putting a conscious effort into dragging her down. Yet no matter how much force she applied, and she had put forth much lately, she could not shut her eyes for even a wink. Her thoughts were racing much too fast for her to comprehend them. One would fire off, only to be muffled by yet another. It was an overlaying system, and soon she could feel her supports cracking under the weight. Oh, how she ached to sleep again, to socialize again. But here she was, just like the past 2 days, alone atop a Pegasus storm. Would she sleep tonight? She did not know. Celestia willing if she would. If not, the idea of slamming full onto the wall was beginning to scrape her mind. What was worse, as though days of sleeplessness and isolation could become such, was the sad fact that she couldn't even place her hoof on the problem. There was a storm brewing in her mind, no doubt about it. But just what that entailed? Well, that was the grand mystery. She breathed out a sigh, adding a bit of cracking vocal ring to it. The scratchy note deflated and was soon whisked away in the ever-constant breeze. To the contrary of her destitute disposition, however, she was nowhere near the verge of giving up. She didn't become the fastest flyer in all of Equestria by giving up, now did she? So, behind her blank expression that gazed into the darkening beyond, she drafted up a mental checklist. She could actually see it, feel it, possibly thanks to her little bookworm friend who always had one of these things at all times. As much as this colorful pony hated to admit it, there were 1 or 2 things she had picked up from that nerd. A mental image of a quill materialized in the ferocious chaos of her mind, scribbling down the appropriate thoughts as they whirled by in a painful maelstrom. She had been at the Grand Galloping Gala just 2 days ago. The thought surprised her, freezing the scrawling utensil in its place. The gala had felt like it had been an eternity away, though, she reasoned as she forced herself to truly see from her eyes, the mashing of days and nights threw everything off. Just yesterday she had eaten a breakfast sandwich in her kitchen at 3 in the afternoon and thought it to be midnight. Sleep deprivation did strange things. After a few moments of taking in the sky, which by now was speckled with tiny shimmers and distant glimmers, her sight receded past her magenta eyes yet again. Her clipboard, paper, and quill were still there, ready to be used, so naturally she used them. The next thing to be scratched down was her failure with the Wonderbolts. How illustrious that had been! To be ignored by her own heroes after she had saved their lives and their pie was not only humiliating, but sickening! The breeze around her picked up, rushing her deeper into the night. Days of endless pity and self-loathing, all for this unknown cause, had turned her numb to the world. By now she hardly flinched at the thin red and yellow strands of hair that lashed at her eyes. She hardly shifted when the cloud beneath her rumbled and boomed with its ominous crack of thunder. Not even once did she try to soothe out the ruffled patches of fur that were popping up across her body. Though to be fair, it wouldn't have made a difference. Her light cyan coat was matted and slick in areas that painted her body with oily polka dots. Her mane was clumped and knotted as it swayed in the sideways wind, and even her tail, which she had once boasted as being the best to ever grace any pony's rump, was nasty and greasy. To top it off, were it not for the unrelenting wind, an awful smell, possibly close to that of a decaying carcass, would be awash in the clouds, spewing her vile collection of odors amassed from days of not showering. With the faded light finally dying to but a whisper on the horizon, and the moon beginning to replace his twin, she retracted to her clipboard. The quill stalled. The next obvious thought whipped by her, striking her hard. She was dumbfounded as how she could put this in words. Her friends, those 5 innocent mares that she actually enjoyed lumbering herself with, had brushed her plights away. That night at good old Donut Joe's, when she had expressed her pain of abandonment by her idols, they had done no more than giggle and say, "At least we have each other." It just wasn't good enough. Guilt. That's what panged her. And not simply in her throbbing mind either. It stabbed at her heart, twisting like the gleaming blade of a knife. She shifted on the cloud, her flat gaze degrading into a more somber, depressed stare. Her eyes drooped impossibly lower, and her lips finally curved downward at their corners. Was she saying that her friends weren't good enough? That the Wonderbolts were better? It was an awful thought, sure, but it was there nonetheless. It crept around her mind like a spider weaving its web ready to trap and devour her. She loved her friends. She loved them dearly. If they were ever in danger, she was there. Just as that pompous little fashion diva she cared for at the bottom of her heart had fallen to the Icarus syndrome, and she had dived down to save her at the cost of her show. The memory was clear in her mind. The wind in her face, the burning of the mock cone, the crack and boom of the colorful pastel circlet as it radiated from behind her. And then, of course, the Wonderbolts. Now the possibility stirred in her gut with a sickening gargle. She might have done it for a friend. She would do anything for a friend. Is what the element of loyalty does, right? But loyalty played fickle in her hooves, and no matter how hard she tried, she could never grasp it. Yes, she was loyal. She made note of this on her foe checklist. But just exactly who was she loyal to? The Wonderbolts had come into her life far before the generous diva had. Hey, she practically worshipped the aerial crew, and she knew it too. So was it them she had saved with her friend being a bonus, or was it the other way around? Quickly she drew a foreleg from beneath her head, wrapping it around her midsection and cringing. Her face scrunched tight, turning instantly red and strained. Teeth barred as she bent into an arch, exposing her neck and plot fully to the night's breathing. The thought of food, perhaps a warm toasted Pop-Tart, flooded her mind, but unfortunately not her gargling stomach. But there was no food in sight, unless she could eat clouds, and from what past experiences told her, that was a big fat no. So she pushed herself down, giving her all to ignore the stabbing in her gut. She forced herself back into a reclined position, letting her face return to its somber frown and glossy stare. As she readjusted, she muttered something in the wind. It was drivel, slurred like only an exhausted or drunken pony could achieve. It was fairly nonsensical, pointless, and lacked in vowels, but it did manage to conjure up that crisp image of the clipboard, paper, and quill yet again. She reviewed its contents with a distanced gaze, listing them down in their order. Failure, rejection, being ignored. So far, it wasn't too bright. The next to go on the list was a less than fortuitous event. Drinking. Criticism galore for such a hobby. She popped the cap off a cold one and sent it down the hatch. Keeping a jubilant mask on wasn't easy, especially not when she'd been ignored by not only her idols but her friends as well. In her world, it was all fair and right to be allowed to relax after such a night, and she supposed that's where the restlessness began. Stars dazzled in the sky above. It was dark now. The last kiss of the sun had faded, depleted from the world. It was now the moon's turn to rule the sky, and rule it did. It was colossal tonight. The cyan and Saubignac could clearly make out each porous crater and splitting crevice that the pale orb had to offer. She felt as though she could simply reach out and graze them with her hoof. She tried, in fact, sprawling her foreleg out from underneath her greasy mane. It extended to its full length, hardly filling the huge gap between her and something so close. Just like her thought, she noted. So close, yet so far. Oh, but what if she could touch it? What if she could graze the moon with her hoof? Would that give her the satisfaction she craved? And what if she could reach these thoughts? What if she could come to peace with herself and her quarreling mind? The first answer that spun through her mind, sleep. A long, deep slumber to make dragons envious. Then food, a meal fit for the princesses. But these were simply physical rewards. Peace would bring acceptance to her mind, perhaps a bit of joy and a touch of laughter. A certain buoyant mass of energy booted the wooden slab from her mind's eye, a pink frothy mane bouncing in harmony with the rest of the pony. She knew this pony as her best friend of them all. They had so much in common, pranksters and jokers to the end of time. Perhaps she simply needed a laugh. The thought of a smile only made her strained lips cease more, though. Smiles and joy were different, as were laughs and happiness. But this pony could combine all four into one big party in a box. She wouldn't trade this mare for the world. The rejection portion of the clipboard flashed its ugly ink. If it truly came down to it, would she abandon her friend for the sake of happiness that was promised but not showed? To be part of an elite team was so tantalizing. How in Equestria could she make up her mind? She pressed her hooves against her head with a full scowl now, shaking her body to and fro. What if she traded her best friend for a lifetime for fortune and fame? What if she surrendered her position as the element of loyalty for a showering of loyalty to her? What if she truly wasn't loyal to her friends at all, but instead resided her loyalty in her lifelong heroes? Questions, questions, and more questions! That was all she could conjure now, these simple questions. Her mind didn't show any signs of stopping either, to her deep, genuine chagrin. What if she had been accepted into the Wonderbolts at the gala? What if she gave up all of her friends for it? What if she had never had those friends in the first place? Even the simple thought, though it brushed her mind for but a mere second, sent waves of disgust through her body. She slowly shook her head, letting her empty eyes fall from the expanse above to the stretching plains of gray upon which she lay. Her mind perked up. For what reason, she did not know, but the spike was there as new questions invaded her splitting head. What if her friends deeply cared? What if the Wonderbolts didn't match up to the love and care she received from her friends every day? What if the fame, the fortune, the rush? What if it just didn't compare? Was that even a possibility? She thought of her friends, each of their smiling faces as they laughed and played, frolicked and leapt together. She was there smiling as well. They were all so happy. Even on her face there was a look of pure, unrefined joy. Was this where she belonged? And then it clicked. So many questions, so few answers, but it clicked. Life was just one big what if. And for the hundreds upon hundreds of what-if questions she could ask, very few had real answers. What fell to her hooves to do was to pick them out, like picking out the good grapes on a dying vine. Those questions, the ones with solid answers behind them, were the true questions, the one that could guide and answer believably. So what if her friends deeply cared? Well, she would love them even more. And what if the fame, fortune, and rush of the Wonderbolts just didn't compare? Well, she would miss where she was now. And finally, what if this is where she belonged? Well, then she'd be happy for the rest of her days. A smile grew on her lips, giving her tense muscles a well-deserved break. She understood now, and she was happy. She was happy with her friends, and were she to leave, she couldn't even begin to fathom the heartbreak. And besides, she reasoned, she already was part of an elite team, the team of her friends, the elements of harmony. Satisfaction alight in her eyes like a freshly relit wicker. She rolled onto her belly and carefully pushed herself to her hooves. Her legs wobbled a bit, and she did stumble once or twice, but in the end she managed to level out. Her eyes darted and glazed evenly with a thick passion. She knew what she was going to do now. First, of course, shower, eat, and rest. She would undoubtedly need these for tomorrow. A day out with friends seemed to be in order. Up higher and higher she flew into the star-splattered sky, the chilling breeze doing its part to lift her sluggish body from the clouds. Slow though she was, the smile on her face wavered not once as she turned away, beat her wings, and disappeared into the cold, welcoming night.
Good evening, everyone. This is Scraticus, and today I'll be reading Cheerilee is No Fun by S.T.
That's all for today, class. You're free to go.
For most of her students, it was greeted with sighs of relief and cheers because on a warm summer afternoon such as this, it was anything but a welcoming study environment. Too many eyes were drawn to the windows with thoughts of relaxation and play. As the rest of the class filed out, however, Cheerilee noted 3 stragglers remaining at their desks. While other students occupied the last hours of class by sleeping or daydreaming, Applebloom, Sweetie Belle, and Scootaloo had spent the time quietly passing notes back and forth. Being ever the optimist, she decided to let it slide, on the hopes that it was at least related to the lecture, but now all 3 of them were huddled together and clearly plotting something. The teacher made her way over to the 3 excited fillies and prompted them.
Girls, I need to lock up the schoolhouse. You'll have to make your way back home now.
Applebloom took that as her cue to respond.
Oh gosh, we're real sorry, Miss Cheerilee, but we're just planning our camp out.
Scootaloo was next to interject.
Don't even bother! An old pony like Miss Cheerilee doesn't know anything about what it's like to be a filly. She's totally out of touch.
Smiling knowingly, the magenta mare offered a comforting grin.
Oh, I think I know all about being a filly. I was one myself, after all.
In response, Scootaloo just rolled her eyes.
Yeah, I bet you spent your whole childhood reading books and being a star student. I'm talking about having fun.
At this point, Sweetie Belle took the opportunity to interject.
Hey, I bet Miss Cheerilee knows all about fun. I bet she'd come with us on our camp out, too.
At this suggestion, Scootaloo and Applebloom both found mischievous grins plastered across their faces and quickly urged her.
Yeah, Miss Cheerilee, you gotta come if you want to prove you're fun.
With a sigh, Cheerilee offered an apologetic smile.
I'm sorry, girls, but I'm too busy today. I have a lot of responsibilities now that I'm an adult. Playing and campouts are for children without responsibilities. Enjoy your time while it lasts.
With that, the little orange filly exploded.
I knew it. She's no fun. Come on, girls.
And without further exchange, they left the schoolhouse. Lacking the energy to retort further, Cheerilee just sighed and closed the door. After a few minutes packing up papers she needed to grade, she locked up and set a course for her house at a steady trot. After dropping her saddlebags at the door, though, she couldn't help but hear the words of the fillies echoing in her head. After thinking for a moment, she lit up with a new idea.
I know how to show them I can have a good time and learn while doing it. I'll just need a book.
Quickly locking her house, she made her way across town to the library. She was well familiar with the 2 inhabitants there, so she concluded that she would have little issue finding what she needed. Before she had scarcely laid a hoof on the door, however, she heard Familiar giggling, and turned to see her 3 troublesome students headed out for their camp-out. This would not normally be a concern, but she noticed that the fillies were headed for the Everfree Forest. Troubled, Cheerilee surrendered the doorknob and quietly followed the trio, wanting to make sure they stayed out of trouble. Following just out of earshot, the teacher was unsure what her 3 protégés were discussing as they skipped along the path, now on a certain course for the overgrowth. Troubled, she began to speed her pace, hoping to catch the 3 before they made the cover of the woods. It almost seemed as though the more she sped up, the faster the girls went in their excitement to begin their camping trip, and by the time Cheerilee was able to reach the first trees, they were nowhere in sight. The teacher began to scour the ground for tracks, but could find nothing because of all the odd foliage covering the ground. Even brushing aside the blue flowers, she was not able to find any tracks, or even trampled petals, so she resigned herself to the realization that they must have taken a different route. While she was worried about the fillies, the mare realized there was little one pony could do to find 3 fillies in the forest and decided to enlist help. First would be Rarity, Sweetie Belle's sister, who lived in town. Cheerilee made her way to the Carousel Boutique and knocked on the door, and after some prompting was welcomed in by Rarity. After not a small amount of fussing over trying to fit her for a dress, Cheerilee was finally able to communicate to Rarity that Sweetie had gone into the woods for a camp-out, but she was surprised to find Rarity unconcerned.
Oh, darling, you should have said something sooner. There's simply nothing to worry about. They're not so much camping out as sleeping over. They're staying with that odd zebra that lives out in the woods. A bit of a ghastly place if you ask me, but I'm not terribly worried. She has proven to be a reasonable steward in the past, and I fear I haven't done my best of giving her the benefit of the doubt. I simply had to let Sweetie go.
Cheerilee raised a brow.
You're letting Sweetie go camping because you feel guilty?
With an incriminating grin, Rarity responded,
Well, perhaps I was also motivated by a need to finish a rather large order without any distractions. Still, you simply must give Zecora the benefit of the doubt. Really, it's none of your business anyway. I hate to be so coarse, but even as a filly when we were back in school, you rarely knew how to cut loose. Remember you took your role in the silly school play so seriously? Let the girls have some fun. Some little girls actually like fun.
Wait, you mean the play you were literally sobbing over because you thought the costumes weren't sparkly enough?
I think you're remembering incorrectly, darling. Now, if you'll be a dear, I've got to work on this order. So, if you please.
Resignedly, Cheerilee made her way out of the shop and headed home. As much as it went against her nature to let her students wander in the forest, Rarity was right. It wasn't her business to butt in. Having had enough excitement for the day, she flipped off the lights immediately when she arrived home and threw herself onto her bed, perhaps the only remnants of her crazy middle years, a waterbed that sloshed back and forth in response to her bombastic entrance. Deciding to grade the papers tomorrow, she relaxed and quickly willed herself to sleep. That night her dreams were plagued by turmoil. An infernal ticking noise filled her ears, and she fruitlessly looked for refuge in a land of endless plateaus and shadows. She wandered for what seemed like miles, but to no avail. She could feel the life being sapped from her body with each step, and she felt hopeless. However, suddenly a ray of light pierced the cloudy heavens and struck the ground not far away. The mare made her way to the contact point, and she found a gold-rimmed mirror. Gazing inside, she gasped, surprised to see the reflection of a much younger pony, before it cracked and she awoke with a start. It was morning, but still dark out. With a groan, Cheerilee decided to get a head start on her work before the sun could come up. She attempted to roll out of bed, but after a full rotation she had not reached the edge. Confused, she rolled again and again, before falling off the bed in a tangle of blankets. Shakily she worked her way up, but found the whole room out of perspective in the dark. Everything seemed too high. Groggily she worked her way over to the counter where she had left her papers, but was surprised to find it above her head. She stood up on her hind hooves and muttered to herself,
What in Celestia's name is going on here?
Half serious, she indulged a little voice of worry at the back of her head and sought out a mirror after turning on the lights, and was horrified to find that she was about a head shorter than when she had went to sleep yesterday. Turning to get the full view of her body, she couldn't help but think that she looked like a little filly. More specifically, she appeared young enough to be in her own class. Cheerilee was certainly an optimist, but even she was not unflappable, and a shriek escaped her before she started to panic. What happened to her? Would she be able to get back to normal? Who would watch her class? She spent most of the morning pacing her house and worrying and stumbling over her now incorrectly proportioned legs until it was well into the day. By noon she remembered that Twilight Sparkle, the inhabitant of the library and an expert magician in her own right, would probably have a solution, so she quickly locked up her house and headed for the library. The mare-turned filly was not halfway to her destination, however, before she felt a large hoof on her shoulder, and was spun around by a light brown police stallion dressed in blue, giving her a stern look.
Is there a problem, officer?
She attempted, cringing at how high her voice had become. Giving an annoyed glare, he shot back,
I think we both know you're playing truant today, little miss. How about we get you back to class? I'm sure Miss Cheerilee would like you to grace her with your presence for the lesson.
Exasperated, she tried to form a response.
But I am Cheerilee!
Though she fully realized how ridiculous the statement sounded from her little filly. Unsurprisingly, the officer was unimpressed and quickly took hold of the little mare's shoulder and started pushing her to her own classroom. With little ado, she was shoved into the schoolhouse and the door slammed behind her. The eyes of all her chatting students, which had been taking advantage of the teacher's absence, turned to her at once. Embarrassed, she did not know what to say. Looking as she did, she realized her former pupils would look upon her as a peer, not an authority, and she would have to come up with an excuse quickly. Fortunately, most of her work was done for her. Applebloom exclaimed,
Are you a new student?
Sheepishly, she acknowledged the yellow filly's statement, and the class circled her, prying answers out of her.
What's your name?
Inquired Snails.
Flower Bloom?
The purple equine offered, giving the name of one of her fellow students from her first time at school.
That explains your cutie mark,
Added Snips. With a condescending frown, Diamond Tiara added,
What kind of cutie mark is that anyway? Gardening? How pathetic. Listen up, Flower Bloom. I'm the boss around here, so don't get in my way.
Giving her best menacing look, Silver Spoon tried to back her up.
I'll keep that in mind,
Cheerilee responded. She was surprised at how tactless the pink filly was without an adult around. She had never realized just how much of an ego Diamond Tiara possessed. Sweetie Belle took the chance to comment.
Your mane and coat look just like our teacher, Miss Cheerilee's. Are you related?
Before she could get any further, however, she was cut off by Scootaloo, who interjected,
Come on, Sweetie Belle! No pony is colored like their relatives. Frankly, the fact that both you and Rarity are white is freaky.
At this point, the class began to devolve into several arguments about familial appearances and patterns, which gave the would-be teacher time to slip away to the door. She was just a few steps outside when she heard Applebloom call,
Wait up!
She turned to see the 3 Crusaders behind her, proudly stating,
If you want to cut class, that's fine. But let us come with you. You look like the kind of pony who knows how to have fun.
Unable to resist the dramatic irony of the situation, the little magenta filly cocked her eyebrows and gave a smirk before saying,
Sure, let's go!
A few minutes later, and she was leading the Crusaders into a dance club. She didn't want to waste any time, so she planned to make her escape after the Crusaders had absorbed themselves into the music. It was still early afternoon, so the club was abandoned, with no ponies at all except the bartender looking rather bored. Cheerilee quickly took to the floor and started putting on all her old moves from back when she was enjoying the wild period of her life, and she was generally enjoying herself for a few moments before she looked up and noticed none of the Crusaders had joined her. Scootaloo was the first to break, stating flatly,
You really think dancing is fun? I guess we were wrong. You are boring.
More than a little hurt, Cheerilee shot back,
Well, then what do you think is fun?
The Crusaders traded knowing glances, and then Scootaloo casually trotted over, closing the distance, and before she could say a word, the orange filly had slapped her, exclaiming,
Tag, you're it!
before all 3 of them bolted out of the door. The diminished mare gave a tired sigh and trotted outside. The Crusaders were waiting outside with large grins, each a safe distance away in case she broke into a sprint, but she chased none of them, electing to walk toward the library instead.
What are you doing? Don't you want to have fun with us?
I'm sorry, you 3, but I don't have time for it right now. Besides, isn't Tag a little bit childish?
Applebloom was quick to close the gap, circling in front of Cheerilee and stopping her in her tracks.
What are you calling childish? We're children after all. It's okay to cut loose and have a little fun. You don't have to be so strung up. Do you think you're...
The little yellow earth pony was surprised to be cut off by an impact, and she looked down to see a magenta leg attached to the hoof that had struck her in the chest.
You're it.
Cheerilee responded gleefully before sprinting off. Laughing at the ruse, Applebloom chased after her, and they spent the better part of an hour playing. By the end, though, Cheerilee realised that she needed to ditch the trio and suggested they switch to hide-and-seek. To buy herself more time, she exploited the knowledge of her students' weaknesses and suggested the fillies count to 70 in multiples of 7, instead of simply counting to 10, and took off as Sweetie Belle stumbled over which multiple comes after 14.
7, 14, which one is next? 14...
With no further interruptions, Cheerilee hammered on the library's door and quickly elicited a response from Twilight, who opened the door in confusion.
Can I help you?
Twilight, you have to help me! It's me, Cheerilee! I woke up today and I'm the size of one of my own students! I think I must be cursed, or it's some bad karma for secretly following my students into the woods yesterday!
Though first surprised, Twilight gave a knowing nod after Cheerilee finished her tale.
Curses involved with the Everfree Forest? I think I know just the solution for this.
She ushered the now little earth pony inside and set about searching the bookshelves.
We're looking for a book called Supernaturals. It should be in the Magical Remedies section, but this is a library, so depending on if someone returned it recently, they may have put it in the wrong place. Spike, can you check the checkout log while we get started looking?
Little rummaging was required before the dragon responded with worry in his voice.
Twilight, I think someone checked it out and hasn't returned it yet. Also, it may be slightly overdue.
Overdue? No pony gets away with that in my library. We'll get that book back and return it to its rightful place if it kills us.
With a word in edgeways, Cheerilee snuck in.
You mean we'll use it to get me back to normal, right, Twilight?
Right. That first. You're right. Who has the book, Spike?
I don't recognize the name, Twilight, but based on the spelling, it looks like one of those ponies that runs the spa that Rarity likes so much.
That would make sense. I remember them asking for Zecora for the recipe. That's a good starting point. I bet they already have a brew cooked up.
Arriving at the spa, Cheerilee was disappointed further.
It's closed today? But I need to get back to my class. They've already missed 1 day.
Ever perseverant, Twilight suggested that she retrieve the book on her own later because there was an alternate source for a cure.
We'll have to go see Sakura. That's where we were cured when we were afflicted with poison joke. Then again, the Everfree Forest is a pretty dangerous place to take a foal.
That's why I tried to stop the girls from going in at all.
Awkwardly, Twilight gave a sheepish response.
Actually, I meant you.
Well, you can't just leave me behind, Twilight.
All right, but stay close and listen to me. I don't want you getting into trouble.
Twilight Sparkle, I'm not really a little girl.
Sorry. We'll just be careful.
They made their way into the woods, which was a surprisingly uneventful journey, aside from Twilight indicating the mysterious blue flowers that she suspected were affecting Cheerilee, which she acknowledged. When they arrived at Sakura's hut, however, they were disappointed to find it empty.
Oh no, Sakura must have gone to find herbs for her potions. If the door is locked, we won't even be able to borrow her book.
Twilight practically moaned in worry. To their surprise, the door to the hut swung open after her statement, and in the doorway they found the Cutie Mark Crusaders.
Hiya, Twilight. We're just coming over to Sakura's to help her clean up after ourselves from partying last night on our camp out.
Apple Bloom began, before being followed by a chorus of
Cutie Mark Crusaders, Hut Cleaners!
Scootaloo's line of contention was more aggressive, though. She scrutinized Cheerilee and remarked,
What are you doing here, Flower Bloom? You already ditched us once.
Twilight suppressed a giggle and whispered,
Flower Bloom?
before getting a glare from Cheerilee.
Well, we were just stopping by to look for Sakura. Little Flower Bloom here needs her help.
Excited once again, the Crusaders formed mischievous grins. Sweetie Belle attempted her most innocent voice and said,
We'll tell you where Sakura went if you finish our game of hide and seek. We never took a turn counting.
Exhausted, the little magenta mare tried,
You can't be serious.
but only got a series of stoic nods, so she caved and acquiesced. As Cheerilee began to count to her sevens, at the instance of a very indignant Sweetie Belle, Twilight gave a bemused laugh and took a seat in the hut to await the end of the game.
7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42.
While a new filly might have difficulty in finding the Crusaders, Cheerilee was able to apply her knowledge of her students once again. Remembering Sweetie's constant resistance to her sister's clean obsession, she was able to locate the unicorn in the nearby swampy water. Searching the skies for the flyer wannabe Scootaloo, she found the Pegasus filly in a tree. When it came to Apple Bloom, she was stumped, quite literally, surrendering to the stump-top base after circling the hut several times. Thoughtfully examining the ground, the magenta mare remembered the soft, moist ground left hoof prints, and she quickly located the set that belonged to Apple Bloom, though they disappeared onto firm grassland after about 50 feet. She was surprised to find, however, a second set returning back to the stump that stopped abruptly halfway with no explanation. Heading over to investigate, Cheerilee bent down to examine the tracks and slammed her face directly into Apple Bloom's side, causing her to topple. With a disappointed whine, Apple Bloom remarked,
Aw, I thought if I used some of Sakura's chameleon elixir, you'd have to stay and play with us longer.
Ever the adult at heart, Cheerilee gave a sigh and said,
Apple Bloom, I appreciate that you like to play with me, but you need to tell me where Sakura went.
That's the thing. We were stalling you because we're not sure where she is right now.
Apple Bloom started before being cut off by another exasperated exclamation by their old teacher, who laid down on the ground, ears back and hoofs over her eyes.
I'm never getting back to normal, am I?
Not a moment too soon, a voice rang out into the clearing.
Do not fill your face with gloom, for I have returned, Flower Bloom. I have brought all the herbs with me, you see, to restore you to Miss Cheerilee.
With surprise, Cheerilee looked up to see Sakura returned with all the herbs necessary to brew an antidote to poison joke. She looked with confusion to the Cutie Mark Crusaders, who were all laughing.
Miss Cheerilee, you couldn't possibly expect us to not recognize you.
Apple Bloom began.
Yeah, especially when it was you that taught us that no two ponies can have the same cutie mark.
Finished Scootaloo. With a big smile, Sweetie Belle said,
We figured out pretty soon that you had probably fallen into poison joke, but we wanted to play with you. When you disappeared, we came here and asked Sakura to start working on a cure.
With more than one sigh of relief, the antidote was quickly brewed, and before the day was out, Cheerilee stood once again at her full height. The next morning, the class at the schoolhouse was all in a ruckus.
Who does that Flower Bloom think she is to leave early her first day, then skip her second? She better not think she gets better treatment than us.
Diamond Tiara clamoured. Cheerilee just smiled and offered.
I think Flower Bloom had to move back home after all.
There was a series of exaggerated cries from the front row, the Crusaders. Apple Bloom remarked amusedly.
Aw, but we were just getting to be good friends.
Scootaloo added.
Yeah, she really knows how to have fun. Not like you at all, Miss Cheerilee.
A statement to which Sweeterbelle responded with a knowing glance.
I don't know. I still think they have a lot in common.
Taking command of her class, most of which were confused by the last few statements, Cheerilee gave a little smile and said,
Well, I'm sure she enjoyed playing with you two girls, but some ponies have a lot of responsibilities. Maybe she can come and visit again someday, when her school isn't so busy.
With that, Cheerilee broke into her lesson for the day, and the Crusaders began plotting on how to slip their teachers some flowers to cause the return of Flower Bloom.